Welcome everybody. Benjamin Belgi from Wings. So we're going to start this webinar. We are very excited to have this important conversation for this webinar co-organized between Charities Aid Foundation, Alliance Magazine, and Wings. So I mean, you all know and have heard about the World Giving Index that CAF is putting together every year. Now it's been 10 years, so that's important to step back and look a bit at the results and what we're learning through this index. So that's the purpose of this webinar today, where we'll be glad to hear perspective from, of course, Charities Aid Foundation itself, represented by Susan Pinkney, the head of research, who will present us a little more about this research and what CAF has been learning throughout the years. Paula Fabiani, the CEO of IDIS, which is the representative of CAF in Brazil, is going to tell us more about the specific context of the culture of giving in Brazil. And Clara Bosco, the civil society resourcing advisor at Civicus, will provide some perspectives on giving in Latin America and support from individual givers to civil society. I just wanted to mention very briefly that at Wings, as you know, we're a global network of philanthropic support organizations, and increasingly our membership is diversifying and including more and more actors who are working towards the development of individual giving, middle-class giving, in addition to more institutionalized philanthropy. And that's something which is very important and also helps us understand how we can engage in a more democratic philanthropic sector and also broaden the understanding of what philanthropy means. And I think the Giving Index has been playing an important role over the years in expanding our understanding of what philanthropy is, not only about money, not only about high net worth individuals or families or corporations, but also about citizens, middle class communities, and how do we look at that. And the other important dimension I hope we will discuss today is really this importance of gathering data and how can we better understand what kind of giving, what kind of philanthropy is happening all over the world, and oftentimes out of the radar and under noticed. So it's very important that we look at indicators like this index to understand the trends and more importantly, to see how we can unlock more philanthropic capital, more giving to support sustainable civil societies and the strong civic states. We know that we need more data to advocate for the field in a time of shrinking space, in a time of challenges for the sector. So we're glad to have this conversation that will look at the importance of data and that will look at how we can help also stimulate the culture of giving all over the world. So I will stop here. I will pass the floor to Andrew Milner, Associate Editor at Alliance Magazine, who will moderate this webinar for us. So, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Benjamin, and welcome, everyone. I'm a freelance writer and editor, and as Benjamin mentioned, if you know me at all, you probably know me best as Associate Editor of Alliance. Before we get on to the panelists, let me just say a couple of words about the format for today. We're probably going to run the session for something like an hour. The presenters will speak for sort of 10 minutes or so each, and then we'll have a question and answer session. If you want to ask a question, and of course we hope you will do, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a Q&A button. If you click on that, you type in your question and we'll see it. So feel free to put questions at any time, but we'll go over to the presenters now without more ado. So first of all, Susan Pinkney, as Benjamin said, Head of Research at CAF and leading on the World Giving Index. Susan, tell us about the World Giving Index, what it is, what it does, and what's been coming out of it over the 10 years.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, I've just got a few charts in terms of kind of basic background to the World Giving Index. So hopefully you're all aware that this is the 10th anniversary of the World Giving Index. We decided to do something a little bit different this year and look at 10-year aggregates rather than year-on-year, which for anyone that's familiar with this report is what we normally do. So we've done something a little bit different. As I say, we've used 10 years worth of aggregate data. We've interviewed over the entirety of that 10-year period 1.3 million people, which we do through the Gallup World Poll, which they collect. They've collected data in 166 countries over those 10 years. This actual 10-year report has 124 countries in it. And the reason for that is that we made a decision to only include countries that had appeared in at least 8 out of the last 10 years for fairness. The World Giving Index is actually really straightforward in terms of what it is. It's 3 very simple questions. So we ask people whether they've donated money, they've helped a stranger, or they've volunteered their time in the last year. And then the actual World Giving Index score is a simple average of those. And then we rank countries. Now, it's interesting that someone just mentioned how we collect data and better data. You know, we will be the first to say that this is very much a starting point. The World Giving Index is a conversation starter that enables us to be places like here today, or talking about generosity on the radio, for example. But clearly, it doesn't have all the answers in it. So more in-depth research is required on that area. So just a few top-line figures from the report that we published about 3 weeks ago. Over the entirety of the 10 years, if you aggregate it up, we see that 2.4 billion people helped a stranger. And actually, of the 3 giving behaviours that we look at, which are deliberately not just about financial giving, due to obviously relative levels of wealth and poverty across the world. So the most performed behaviour is those for helping a stranger. Having said that, we still see that 1 in 3 people have donated money to charity in the last 12 months, and that 1 in 5 people have volunteered their time. So that's the very top line. When we look at the aggregate over the 10 years, most generous, this is the top 10 that we have. And we see that it's USA that actually comes out as number 1 at 58%. One of the things I really like about this chart is there's no kind of golden bullet, as it were, to what makes a country generous. So 7 of them, including the US, are some of the wealthiest nations in the world, but 3 of them aren't. So countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Indonesia are in there as well. We also see within that top 10, there's diverse religions, there's different prevalent cultures in there. So when we sat back and had a look at this and thought, well, you know, what do all these countries have in common? There's not actually a huge amount that all 10 have in common, which I think in terms of what we do in encouraging generosity and giving is actually a really, really positive finding. I think, you know, especially in maybe the society we're in at the moment, which quite often feels a little bit divided and a little bit polarised, there's quite a lot that unites us. I think the other point to make on this chart is you do have countries such as the USA, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, in there, but a number of these countries have actually fallen back over the last few years. So these would be in the top 10, but I think if you were to look at the last 5 years, the makeup wouldn't be as it is now. And so if we redo this in another 10 years' time, or even another 5 years' time, I would expect this 10 to look quite different. In terms of who gives more, is it men or women? Actually, we're all pretty similar when it comes down to it. If you look at the middle boxes on this chart in the purple, you see that 29% of both men and women say that they've donated money in the last 12 months. Men are slightly more likely to help a stranger at 49% versus 46%. And in terms of giving time through volunteering, again, slightly higher with men at 22 and 19. So anyone who knows stats will know that on a base size of over 1 million, any change is going to be statistically significantly different. But they are still pretty close together, so kind of equally generous on that front. And then in terms of across the generations, so who's most likely to give, so again, looking at the middle boxes there, giving money is something that increases with age. That's quite often because the older you get, the more disposable income you have to be able to give financially to charity. So that rises from 25% amongst 15 to 29-year-olds up to 32% amongst those who are 50 plus. Again, in terms of helping a stranger, it's not quite linear. That peaks amongst those aged 30 to 49 at 50%. And there's really not much in it when it comes to volunteering, where it's for pretty much everyone, 1 in 5 are volunteering time. So the one that's got the biggest difference really and is more linear is the one we might expect it to, which is donating money. And then, who are the biggest risers and fallers over time? This is quite interesting. We have Indonesia is the biggest riser at number 1, followed by Kenya, followed by Singapore, but a whole kind of range of countries going into that biggest risers. 5 of them are actually from Asia. We have 3 African countries in there. There's 1 European country, which is Bosnia-Herzegovina, which, obviously for bad reasons, 10 years ago was in a very different place. So we kind of expect that to rise. But I think it's really positive that we're starting to see kind of emerging economies come into that top 10. And I'll go on to some of the reasons why they might be up there in a minute as well. Again, on the bottom 10, when we sat back and had to think about what do these countries have in common, are there any themes we can see on the biggest fallers, there didn't actually seem to be one specific reason or even a number of specific reasons as to why they'd fallen back. So from 10 years ago to now, Morocco fell the most, followed by Afghanistan, followed by Cambodia. And then just looking at 10-year aggregate scores across the continents, having seen the USA and Canada so high up on the World Giving Index, it's probably no surprise that they're also really high when it comes to their aggregate score on this one. The same with Oceania, which for the purposes of the World Giving Index only includes Australia and New Zealand. But it was really to show you the other continents such as Africa, for example, which we see is 30% on this chart, but actually if we look at it as a line over time, and last year's score for the African countries, it actually goes up to 33, so it's been building over time. Latin America, which we're talking about today, at 32%, so actually putting it ahead of Africa and also 1 point ahead of Europe, and not much in it between Latin America and Asia. When we look specifically, as I say, on Latin America over time, we can see that the Helping a Stranger score has increased quite significantly since 2010. So that goes from a 45% back then in the World Giving Index 2010 up to 51% in 2018. So if you were to draw a line through that, clearly it's on a bit of an upwards trend there. Score for donating money, however, has decreased since 2010. That's gone down from about 28% down to 21%. So fewer people giving financially. And then just finally to have a look at within Latin America who the top giving countries are, and it would be interesting actually to hear from others later on if this is what you would expect to have seen or not. So we actually see that across the continent is Guatemala that comes out as number 1. Followed by Haiti, followed by Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and you can probably pick out your own countries from this list. But yeah, sort of diverse across whether it be South or Central America within this chart. There's a whole mix in there. And then just finally, I just wanted to talk about some of the themes that we've identified. Obviously, I said at the start, 3 questions isn't going to tell us everything we need to know about global philanthropy, but there are trends themes you can see that have happened over those 10 years. And these are just 3 of them that we will probably follow up on over the next few months and write about in more detail. But just to give you a flavour, so things like religion is something that comes out as a big driver. So whether that be because we've interviewed in Muslim countries straight after Ramadan, or in more Western countries where we have with Christianity, straight after Christmas, which are our peak giving periods, or whether that be in Myanmar, which was #1 in 3 consecutive World Giving Indices we put out, very much linked to the practice of Theravada Buddhism of giving small amounts and regularly. So there's quite a lot of that in there. Or it could be there's another one we've seen around government initiatives. So we see, for example, Indonesia has also been #1 within recent years on the World Giving Index, and is the #1 biggest riser. And the Indonesian government relatively recently worked together with the United Nations to link zakat giving to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we think that's had some sort of impact in terms of people giving or recognising that their giving is actually charitable giving. So some things happen there. We see in countries such as Singapore, which has also gone up quite considerably in the rankings, there's been a big push towards volunteering from their government to encourage people to volunteer, so that can have an impact. And then the picture here is actually the president of Turkmenistan, where we have things called Saturday Subotniks. So we've quite often seen Turkmenistan come out as #1 in terms of volunteering. And we think that's because of these Saturday Subotniks, where it's kind of enforced volunteering on a Saturday, and that's kind of put them up the rankings. And in fact, one year we saw Turkmenistan go down quite rapidly, and when we asked around to find out what that was, it was because the Subotniks had been pulled that year. So government initiatives, whether you think they're positive or negative, can have an impact. And then the final thing that we're seeing is kind of deep-rooted cultures. So things like Ubuntu in parts of Africa, very much encouraging the giving idea. The fact that helping a stranger is very much embedded within African cultures, and then other things that we're seeing around that. So that was a whistle-stop tour around 10 years of the World Giving Index. So I'll pass you on to, I think it's Paula.
Thanks very much for that, Susan. Could I just ask a clarifying question
Sure.
on the World Giving Index? It's obviously sort of it's percentages of people who give, so it's not so much about how much they give or why they give, or they get a bit of feeling for that. It's more about sort of what percentage is giving. That's right, is it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we don't quantify it. I got asked this question last week, actually, if we could quantify it. Would we in terms of the amount? And I'm not sure that we would, because one of the great things about World Giving Index is that you have these 3 different behaviours, and then it's just, as I say, this average. And if we were to start adding in things like how much people give, then that would kind of change the dynamic, and there would be much heavier weighting to the sort of financial aspect of it. So within more specific in-country research that we've done, certainly there are questions that we ask and we pick up on, but I think from a kind of global comparative, how generous are we, I actually think it would be a little bit dangerous to put it in there.
Yeah, I was kind of really just clarifying. I wasn't suggesting you should.
Yeah, no, sure.
Interesting, there are no predictive factors. We'll maybe talk about that later on. Paula, could I bring you in, please? I think you're going to give a specifically sort of Brazilian sort of perspective on the Giving Index, aren't you?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to bring the perspective of the context in Brazil. IDIS is a non-profit organization that promotes giving and its impact in Brazil and somehow in Latin America as well. Thank you, Susan, for all the information about Latin America. I have a slide on that, but just to position Brazil. And so I'll start mentioning the positioning of the ranking in Latin America in a couple of aspects. As you see, the distribution, helping a stranger is the most important behavior in Latin America. We actually rank in the average of the worldwide ranking. Brazil ranks 46 in terms of percentage of the population that that help a stranger. And when we look into the distribution among the Latin American countries, we see that the giving is the behavior that has the largest variation for 13 to 45%, followed by volunteering and then help a stranger. And it's also giving and volunteering where we rank lower than the average of the world in Latin America. As Susan mentioned, 1 in 5 volunteer, and in Brazil, for example, we have 15, and in giving, it's 1 in 3, and we only 22% of Brazilians donate. But it's important to note that despite a diverse range of economic and political changes, the region has presented an overall resilience and actually has increased, as Susan mentioned, has increased the number of people helping a stranger. And we also would like to note, and this is part of IDIS work, that establishing the foundations for a culture of giving, you really need some resilience because it takes time and also stability. And the region has gone through important turmoil and uncertainty in the last years. So with that, I would like to focus on Brazil, that ranks on the second half of the Latin American countries. So we actually rank low in comparison to similar countries with similar, actually Brazil has a really large GDP. So we could certainly rank much higher than we do. And a couple of reasons we identified in the past. And as Susan mentioned, there are some regions where you have government having specific policies to promote giving, and we don't have that in Brazil in the last governments that we have. And this is something that IDIS has been advocating and trying to reach the government so that we start having public policies to promote giving and promote engagement. With that, I would just like to show what happened in the 10-year behavior in Brazil. As we see, we had a peak in 2016, the report of 2016 that reflects numbers of 2015. And what happened in that year is that we have a big disaster an environmental disaster in Mariana. Mariana is a region in the middle of the country, and then that disaster led many people to get engaged in the practice of giving, and also, but then with that we see that and we also have the Olympics that also helped the numbers of volunteering and so on, but then we ended up coming back to the previous numbers that we had in the past. And looking more deeply, when we look into the specific numbers, as I mentioned before, we had in Brazil 46% of people practicing helping a stranger. 15 is the next slide. 15 doing volunteering, and 22 giving money to organizations, which are these last two are both below the worldwide average. And what we see in Brazil in the last years is also a feeling of less hope, less confidence in the future, which reflected in less engagement. And looking closely into the numbers, as Susan has done for Latin America, for the world, we took a look in gender. When we look in gender, we see that there is not much variance between men and women. Women, different from the rest of the world, women are slightly more likely than men to have helped a stranger. And in Brazil, okay? But the other numbers are, we also have a difference in giving money, and which reflected that women tend to be more generous than men in Brazil, different from the numbers of the rest of the world. But it's very close, so if we take in consideration it's really similar actually. And looking into age, that's when we get concerned in Brazil, because our numbers, when we look into age, which is the next slide, present a larger variation for young people. So in a way, our young people tend to donate less money and also help less a stranger. Here we can see a big difference from older generations, and we shows us that there is a lot of work to be done with the younger generations to increase engagement in such practices in Brazil. And moreover, so I was asked to take a look into applications of number of the data that we produce, and I decided to take a look into different research that we have in Brazil. Besides the World Giving Index, we also have done the Brazil Giving Research, which is the deepest research about giving behavior in Brazil. And we estimated the amount donated by individuals, because every time we disseminated the World Giving Index numbers, we would be asked by journalists, and also the sector lacked information about the amounts given, because Brazilian incentives are only for projects, so people don't put in their tax revenue reports the amounts that they give, because there are no tax incentives. So the government does not have formal giving numbers in Brazil. That's why we decided to do this research that was conducted by Gallup, and we estimated the amount donated, which is 0.23 of our gross domestic product. And what we see is that many organizations use such numbers heavily on the fundraising strategies, and also we are using it in the Culture of Giving campaign that we have launched last year, and that we are certainly continue to promote the culture of giving. So numbers are very important in that sense. Moreover, some governmental initiatives for civil participation have used such numbers, and also advocacy initiatives. For example, we have advocated for an endowment legislation in Brazil, and providing numbers about giving was crucial to convince the government that this is an important path to have long-term resources for causes and for civil society organizations. Besides that, the press loves numbers, and that's how they talk about giving, and also the academia uses such data in a very important way. And we also use in our presentations that many of our colleagues in Brazil have been using the numbers of the donations research that we have done. And now end with an analysis of the benchmark of corporate social investment that looks only into giving and corporate social investment practices of companies and corporate foundations in Brazil. So they look into the companies in Brazil. And the corporate itself, they brought together to analyze this and trends and discuss, they can identify ways to promote corporate social investment in Brazil. And also they reflect such numbers in their strategies for social investments. And So they use the benchmark to plan how much they're going to use or direct funds to social investments in Brazil. And obviously, the press and the academia also uses such data. So it's very important to produce data so that we can really bring the importance of civil society, the importance of giving to the press, to the corporations' practices, and also to the individuals, to our society, to promote the practice of giving and social engagement in our society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. Thank you very much for that. That's the picture in Brazil. I'm going to go straight over to Clara Bosco now from Civicus. Clara, you're going to cast a sort of slightly different light on the numbers we've been hearing, because you've done some, well, Civicus has done some research on the sort of resourcing needs of civil society organizations in Latin America. So that's from the sort of demand side, if you will, rather than supply side. So tell us about that, would you?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks to Charities Aid Foundation, Wings and Alliance for giving us the opportunity to be in this session. For me, it was fascinating to hear some of these trends in giving and backed with such a robust set of data. So yeah, so for us at Civicus, there's, I think, sort of no surprise that giving for us, it's really an important aspect of resourcing civil society. And if I may, also an important aspect of manifesting activism and citizen action. Just quickly, for those of you who don't know us, Civicus is a global alliance of over 8,000 individuals and organizations that work to promote civil society and protect and defend civic space and democratic values around the world. And so, of course, we have a vision of a more resilient, diverse, and vibrant civil society, one with the agency and resources necessary to realize, a more just, inclusive, and sustainable world. So, of course, the notion of individual giving plays a very important role in these and in our vision. But as you mentioned, what we wanted to share with you today was some analysis and some questions that actually we posed to ourselves after having reviewed a very large data set of published calls for proposals and resourcing opportunities for civil society that might perhaps complement the information that we've discussed so far with an additional angle, that could look at sort of issues of the access to resources and support of civil society in Latin America, and therefore that help us understand even more why individual giving is becoming more and more important in general, but in particular in a region such as Latin America. Before I share with you those facts and findings, I think it's important to maybe just give a brief background overview on the context in Latin America. So it is one of the most, if not the most, unequal regions in the world. It's a region where the conditions for civic space are deteriorating quite worryingly. If you look at this map that is in the slide, this is the map that is provided by the Civicus Monitor. This is a large research collaborative hosted by Civicus that monitors practically in real time conditions for civic space in each and every country of the world. And this gives you a sense of the situation of civic space in the region. So that the Civicus Monitor provides also kind of a rating of the conditions of civic space on a 5-point scale that ranges from completely closed spaces to completely open spaces. Color-coded. So if you see the region is leaning more and more towards repressed and obstructed conditions for civic space, and therefore the conditions for civil society to organize, to speak out and take action, including the ability for civil society to mobilize the support and resources that they need for that, is seriously under scrutiny. This is also one of the most deadliest regions for human rights defenders, for indigenous activists, for journalists in the world.
Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico are featured in the top 10, I think, countries that are most deadliest for these human rights defenders. And then what you might have probably read in the news throughout the last months is that there is a spike in conservative and anti-right movements all across the region that are gaining ground, and there is definitely a democratic regression taking place in the region. Some of these governments are directly attacking civil society organizations. If you think of what's happening, in fact, in Brazil with Bolsonaro, or some of the instances, for instance, I think of Mexico with the president threatening to cut all the state funding for civil society organizations. So the situation for civil society is quite serious there, with attempts to make it more difficult through bureaucratic and other funding restrictions to access support and resources, and also with this attempt to delegitimize some parts of civil society, especially those that are so key at this point in time, those that are trying to challenge power holders and to hold them to account, those that are promoting and protecting human rights and better conditions, especially for the most historically marginalized groups. So with this context, just to say that I believe that it's really sort of more important than ever to pay attention to the solidarity and the resources we may want to give to civil society in the region, especially the most change-seeking parts of civil society. And that's where I think that a deeper analysis into individual giving and opportunities need to be kept in check. So with that, I wanted to share with you this fascinating analysis that we carried out together with Impactia, a small social enterprise based in Colombia. We have analyzed a large database that Impactia has with more than 6,000 call for proposals issued by 2,000 donors, and that were published between 2014 and 2017. So this is a quite large data set of information. The calls for proposals that were tracked by Impactia, as this is their business model, were covering a wide range of funding opportunities for development in Latin America. So opportunities available but not exclusive to civil society. And for us, what was very important to find through this analysis is that some of the assumptions, some of the trends that we knew were there, that we've been talking about, were confirmed. But what was really shocking was the extent to which some of these facts were pointing to the seriousness of the constraints that civil society has to access resources, and meaningful resources, in fact. And so for us, this data has been really, really instrumental to, as I said, better understand the extent to which some of these concerns are actually serious and happening. Then, of course, I agree with what was said before. The data is just a conversation starter. So with this data, we're being more able to open up conversations, and not just us. A wide range of partners and members are using this data to advocate for better resources in the region. So what does this data tell us? I just provide here an infographic with some of the key findings, but if you download the report, which is available in Spanish and English, you can actually see more facts we've been unpacking more elements. I just thought that these were some of the key facts that could be relevant for the conversation we're having today. And so, for instance, as I said, the data set was very wide, and looking at the data on a superficial level, we thought that after all, civil society did have enough access to a wide range of opportunities, because I think a little bit more than half of all the opportunities that were tracked were actually accessible or open for civil society. But then looking better into the data and more deeply into the data, we realized that actually only 12% of all resources tracked in the database were exclusively designed and for civil society. And actually, looking even better, that just 3% of all those resources were exclusive for civil society of Latin America. So at the end of the day, what we've realized is that the resources that are really accessible and designed just for these specific groups are very, very few and scarce. This comes also with the realization of the high competition that civil society has to face when trying to access these types of resources. If you look at the left bottom part of the slide, you will see that there is really sort of very high rates of competition. Well, of course, for the local civil society groups, not just with international civil society organizations, and that's definitely something that we should be unpacking a bit more in further analysis, but also with the private sector, with national entities, and even with international bodies such as the United Nations. Then, of course, the competition is under unequal conditions, because how can you compare the resources and the capacities of a small civil society group, say, I don't know, in Guatemala, with an international NGO who has, an army of fundraisers that are able to detect in time the opportunity, to prepare all the documentations, to, qualify for all the thresholds that are out there. So it's really worrying, the sort of the context that really makes it very difficult for local civil society groups to access resources. Besides the issue of accessibility, I think what was very striking for us was also that there seemed to really be an insufficient investment in a vibrant, diverse, and sustainable civil society. This is very worrisome in the context of the growing restrictions of civic space. Of all the resources that we've tracked that were accessible for civil society, less than 3% of these resources were actually supporting core operations, institutional strengthening, and therefore the sustainability of these groups. While the vast majority, 97%, in fact, of all those resources were actually going towards implementation of projects and service delivery. So that's definitely, again, something to consider in terms of the quality of resources that are available out there, not just not very accessible, but also at the end of the day, perhaps not very conducive to invest in long-term struggles or to invest in the sustainability and resilience of these groups. Another aspect that may be relevant to connect with this is the fact that there's very little investment also in the promotion of human rights, political advocacy, and activism. Very few, again, opportunities were mainstream for these types of actions, of activism, which in fact represents to us one of those unique pockets where civil society can really add a unique value in our societies. Because for the rest, for service delivery, of course, civil society can step in and support, but that's not one of those unique and irreplaceable roles that it can play. And then just quickly, one last fact, again, I think could be relevant for our conversation around individual giving, is that while the global north seems to still be the major source of fund and support for these kind of opportunities, it is decreasing. There's a majority of international donors are actually withdrawing from the region, while there is a growing presence and a more important presence of Latin American funders of all sorts. So we need to be paying more attention to those Latin American donors that are gaining confidence so that they can play such a role in a more transparent, democratic, equitable, and flexible manner, and keeping into consideration the importance of investing in a diverse, resilient, and sustainable civil society as a goal in itself, and not as a means to achieve other objectives, other goals, such as delivering services. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think these are the sort of the main facts that I wanted to share with you, that I thought could be relevant for this conversation. And in these slides, I might just not go through them, but just to say that for us, this really is once more a confirmation that there is a need to mount a range of responses to the resourcing needs of civil society that actually, depending on those kinds of resources that I've just presented, are probably not the best way to achieve resilience, sustainability, and therefore the need to be paying more attention to local giving and to individual giving as a way to diversify resources, but to also stay more grounded in own communities, which could also sort of strengthen resilience, legitimacy, and at the end of the day, the sustainability. And then, of course, this comes with two conditions. On one hand, the need for all of us to be better at advocating and promoting a more enabling environment for giving and domestic resource mobilization in these countries, and at the same time, to also equipping ourselves and strengthening internal capacities to be able to tap into these different types of resources and support. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Clara. So, yeah, Latin American civil society organizations are struggling against scarce resources, often sort of contracting space, and they're also going to get sort of institutional support as against project support. It's a fairly common picture, I suspect. Maybe we can come back and talk about that in a little while, but I'm conscious of time getting on, so I'd like to get onto a couple of questions that have already been sent in, if that's okay. Right, I guess this one is for you, Susan, as much as anyone, and perhaps Paula too. It's how much WGI data is used in academic papers, and are there possibilities of international comparative joint research using the data?
It's used a lot. We hear about it anecdotally, a lot being used from, I gave a lecture at the University of Kent philanthropy course the other week there, and they were saying on this, and they were saying how much they use it. It comes up time after time, people telling us we use it. So we don't send it to them directly, but they do pick it up from the CAF website, and it seems to do exactly what we're doing today, kind of engender conversations and enable people to, in the example of the University of Kent, were forming hypotheses on the basis of it and then going off to do research papers on it themselves. So it is used massively on that. I think on international comparisons, I think you do have to be a little bit careful. My background is actually consumer research before coming into the charity side of things, and you do see cultural differences in terms of how people respond to questionnaires and how they answer specific questions, with some more likely to say yes than others. So I think that's where the trend lines come in and being able to look at it over time. So clearly if you're seeing something like an increase in Africa over time, that's really what you're looking at rather than particularly relative to each other. So those kind of movements that you're looking out for.
Okay. Could I just ask you, are you aware of any examples where people have used the data to make changes locally?
I'm not. As I say, it's although actually that's not true. It was really interesting hearing Clara speak specifically about what they've seen in Civicus, which I hadn't heard that presented before, because we've actually just recently at CAF got funding from Mott Foundation, Aggregate, and the National Lottery in the UK to look at 4 African countries and look at individual giving in more detail. Now, partly that came about because we had these World Giving Index findings, and we wanted to start exploring markets in more detail. But I was in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago running workshops on that, and a number of people came up to me there from places like Ghana and Rwanda saying, we look out for this every year and we sit down in our office and we use it to plan for the next year because it's basically the only thing that we have. So things like that for me as a researcher are incredibly rewarding. So as much as it may only be 3 questions, and we're very privileged in the UK, for example, that we run a 12,000 interview a year tracking study about UK giving behaviour, this probably is the only thing that exists somewhere, say like if you take Rwanda, for example. So it is used within those kind of contexts, yes.
Thank you. The question coming out about sort of the use of crowdfunding. Is there any evidence to suggest that giving via crowdfunding sites is actually displacing sort of more traditional methods of giving? Is crowdfunding actually sort of captured through the WGI data?
That's a really interesting one. We're doing quite another strand that we're looking at the moment, because as I said, we're starting to see a decrease in wealthier nations over the last few years, and we actually saw. So what started this conversation was early in the year with our UK specific report. We'd seen a decline in giving over the last 3 years. Things like the Giving USA report that the Lilly School of Philanthropy put out have shown a decrease in the US, etc. So the kind of overall mood music at the moment is that giving is starting to decrease. So as part of that, we've been trying to look at what might be causing that decrease, and certainly I don't think it's just one thing. Crowdfunding could be part of it, divides in society, also kind of non-traditional charities. So again, because it's closest to home, the UK, we have the example of Extinction Rebellion recently, who aren't a registered charity. They're what's described as a movement, but they managed to raise £850,000 in 1 week through crowdfunding. So there is an argument that if you're giving your money to that non-charity in the traditional sense, are you also then giving to traditional charity? So I'm not sure there's any concrete evidence on that at the moment, but it's definitely something that we and others are looking into at the moment.
That's another area, isn't it? Yeah. Does the research in Latin America explain factors where some SDGs are prioritised over others in donor contributions? Clara, I wonder if you could comment on that one.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we did look into sort of the themes that receive the most of resources and support, and we did use the SDGs as thematic proxies for that. Although the research time frame from 2014 to 2017 does not entirely overlap with the beginning of the SDG, so it wouldn't be accurate to say that we're talking about sort of exactly SDG. So we've reorganized the database using SDG, but about ex post, just to give this disclaimer. But having said that, what we did detect is that there is serious investment going to education. Education takes up 25% of all the resources that were tracked in our database, followed by inequality, 15%, and peace and justice, 12%. So these three are the three sort of SDGs or thematic areas, if you may, that cover up more than the half of all the resources tracked in the database. On the other end of the spectrum, that was really surprising in a bad way. We saw that just 1% of the resources were going towards climate change, 2% towards biodiversity, and 1.7% on gender equality and women's empowerment. And that's really striking in a region such as Latin America, which is really struggling with issues of gender-based violence and inequality. Hello?
Hello?
Andrew, I think you've muted yourself.
Yes. Sorry, that was. I've got a couple of questions here about the sort of non-cash elements of giving that WGI mentions. One is whether you find any changes in measure of methodology in order to sort of make more of that, and what's behind it in the first place.
Sorry, so Susan, you cracked up at the start of that question. Could you repeat it? Sorry.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit more about the sort of the measurement of non-cash giving in the WGI? And are you planning any new approaches in that regard, and what's sort of behind it in the first place?
No, I mean, literally within World Giving Index, it asks about volunteering time, helping a stranger, and donating money in the last year, and that's all that's included in that. I mean, if you go back to, again, the Africa research that I was talking about, where we are able to delve into that behaviours in a lot more detail, then we are picking up on things such as the Ubuntu concept a lot more, things like Stockvilles in South Africa, and just getting into much more the overall culture of giving, and in terms of whether that be financial, which in this instance is incredibly linked towards the informal side of giving, which again World Giving Index doesn't necessarily always pick up, because certainly you speak to people over there and you talk about giving, and they don't see giving in the same way as I would, for example, in that if they're helping an extended family member or someone in their community, that's, you know, it's just what they do, and it's kind of quite humbling that that's not thought of as giving, whereas I absolutely would think of it that way. So I think it's really important within specific cultures to start trying to unpick these things in a lot more detail and find out what's driving these behaviours. I know we've seen countries such as, I think on the 10-year aggregate, actually, it's Liberia that comes through as number one in terms of the helping a stranger overall. So it would be fascinating to be able to do much more research into what it is that's driving that happening there that may not necessarily be happening sitting in the UK, for example. So there's loads of sort of specific cultural nuances, but I don't think the World Giving Index is a platform for that. I think it's people such as CAF or others picking up that mantle and being able to go out and look at countries in a lot more detail and unpick that overall giving behaviour.
Thank you. Thank you. Someone's asked you a question about this. It seems to be almost a sort of, in some respects, a golden age for philanthropy, as he calls it, significant intergenerational transfer of wealth, growing middle-class communities with disposable incomes, and yet we're getting this backlash that Clara was talking about against civil society. What do we make of the data? Does it give us greater optimism or for pessimism? What's your feeling? What's your feeling on this? I mean, this is a question for all of you, really. Hello?
Hello, so I'll start. It's Paula Fabiani.
Okay, Paula.
I tend to see everything with optimism, because I think there is an opportunity there. I see that in a way there is more energy in Latin America in terms of unsatisfaction with inequality, with the role of the governments, and a general feeling that something needs to be changed. And the challenge is, how can we catalyze such energy into giving behaviors or in civil society and citizenship behavior? So I see that we have a great opportunity. The challenge is how we can define common agendas with our peers, and to create or to help create movements that can catalyze such energy. Because the polarized the societies are now very polarized, which makes we are sort of fragmented in that sense. And we need to find common themes that we can work together. And I think that giving is a common thing to all civil society organizations.
Okay. And anyone else to listen to that?
Can I? This is Clara.
Hi, Clara.
Yeah, I tend to agree with what Paula said. I'm quite optimist, and just to maybe say that it is true. No, you can see that there is a spike in citizens taking to the streets to, really there is a rise in activism in various forms, in various ways. And so I also heard colleagues or members in Turkey saying that for example, giving there is increasing, or sort of as a way of activism in a space that is particularly repressed, because there is a personal need to do something about what's going on, but also that's probably one of the ways that can be done. And so I think I definitely stay optimistic. And as Paula was saying, it's more of a matter of understanding how to channel this desire, this need to be more active and taking things in own hands, from maybe protest to more propositional, forms of activism that, of course, then are connected to ways of giving in different ways. Of course, not just giving money, but being more active.
Okay. Here's a question which opens up a sort of more general thing about data and use it. How do you find? How do we create more precise data to understand the profiles of individual giving? And this, for me, this brings the question of both sides. You talk about the World Giving Index, and we talk about the sort of starvation of CSOs in Latin America, especially human rights and political advocacy ones. There seems to be a sort of a missing bit in the middle. How do we bring the two together? Is there sort of an obvious data gap here that we can use to sort of steer one towards the other?
Yeah, I mean, from a sort of survey data perspective, which is my area of expertise, I think that there definitely is. There's certain countries across the globe that have very rich data on these things, such as the US, the UK, Netherlands, just a few examples. And then there are others where there's a real lack of data sitting there. And I think that unless we understand the kind of context of giving behaviour and how that works, whether that be in what we would see as traditional or non-traditional senses, it is really difficult to kind of join up the dots and then kind of join up the dots even further when it comes to kind of international organisations, international donors, etc. So for me, there is a gap in terms of that richness sitting there in the middle.
Anyone else want to comment on that one? Is the question, is there any obvious explanation for the declining giving in certain wealthy countries like the US and Canada? It's highlighted in the index.
This is what saying we've seen before, and what is worrying for me, and I completely agree with Paula and Clara in that activism and everything else is great, especially amongst younger generations, and hopefully that will convert into giving. But we are seeing a decline in giving financially, and that seems to be in terms of mass participation in the wealthier nations. So for me, that is a concern. We think there's probably multiple reasons for that, and there's a little bit of we're in a perfect storm at the moment. So we have the polarization in society where things seem to be becoming a little bit black and white, so you're one thing or the other, and we think that charitable giving might be falling into those categories. There's what someone mentioned before around kind of crowdfunding and non-traditional ways of giving, which is still giving but isn't technically charity. There's various legislations that have come into play. So in the States, there's been tax reforms in the last couple of years. For example, in the European countries, we had a change in privacy legislation. We have evidence in countries such as the UK and the Netherlands where charities seem to be asking less, so concentrating much more on core supporters, which then in turn means that mass giving tends to go down a little bit. So I could probably go on for another 5 or 6 reasons. So I think that we are kind of in this perfect storm at the moment in the wealthier nations. Trust is something as well, not just trust in charities, but trust in institutions. Full stop. That's also playing a role. So unfortunately, I think we are just in this kind of perfect storm, and it's important for people like us and other key players to try and work out what the key drivers are behind that, and try and address them to kind of reverse this decline or stagnation.
Okay. Well, I guess we're pretty much out of time now, so unless anybody's got anything to add, I think I'd better wrap these proceedings up. Thank you to all, Susan, Paula, Clara. Thanks for your very, very informative presentations. Thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks to Wings and CAF and also to Alliance for hosting the thing. And a special thank you to the people who've sort of coordinated and organised the whole thing, who are largely invisible but who are all important. So thanks very much to all of you.